Thank you for joining us. Welcome back. This is our second cohort, and we've grown. We have more international students joining us as well. 61? 61 students, yeah.
Wow.
Don, do you want to say? Okay. Okay. So, welcome back, everyone. We have Professor Per Bylund joining us. Per is a professor at Oklahoma State University, and he's a professor of entrepreneurship and economics, as well as I believe, a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. So, Per, welcome, and the floor is yours. So we can see you.
Thank you so much. So let me try and share my screen. You can see this, right?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So that's exactly right. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship. There's a bit of an echo too. Could you perhaps mute your computer?
Oh, yes.
All right. So yes, yeah, I'm a professor at Oklahoma State University, where I teach entrepreneurship. Very often entrepreneurship is sort of a very practical field, whereas in Austrian economics Austrian economic theory is not super practical. It's very more like instructive and useful in how we think about the world and how we understand the world. It's like I tell my students, I might know a lot about entrepreneurship, but I can't really tell them how to make money. Had I known how to make money, then I would definitely not teach it. I would do it. But there's a lot to learn and know about entrepreneurship that is super important, and especially from an Austrian perspective. And I think this is one of those aspects of Austrian theory where Austrians really stand out compared to the mainstream. And if you study mainstream economics, you're going to pretty soon, at least if you're an Austrian, you're going to wonder, where is the entrepreneur? Because there's basically no entrepreneur at all. They might mention entrepreneurship at some point, but that's only as sort of a synonym for small businesses. So there's entrepreneurship in general equilibrium because all businesses are small and price takers. But other than that, there's basically nothing going on at all, except for in policy, where policy is crafted and developed in order to increase entrepreneurship, by which policymakers typically mean, and economists too, I suppose, creating businesses that create jobs. So it's a matter of macroeconomic policy, trying to make people start businesses so that there are more jobs in the economy and the politicians look better in the eyes of voters. Of course, that completely misrepresents what entrepreneurship is and what its function in the economy. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, or I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And as the agenda, I have first just talk about what does it actually mean that the market is, as Austrians perceive it, an entrepreneurial process rather than just a static system as is typically taught. Or perhaps as a circular flow, as we sometimes learn in some courses. What does it mean that the market is a process and that it's entrepreneurially driven? What are the implications? What does that mean in terms of what Austrians can understand and explain that others cannot? And then I'll go into talking about different views of entrepreneurship within Austrian economics. I'm skipping Menger here, and that's in the sense that I have a reason for it. so don't worry. But it's also It's notable that already in Menger's treatise from 1871, he spends a little time on entrepreneurship, which he sees sort of as the starting and running of businesses. He says has a very sort of pragmatic approach, in the sense that describing exactly what we today teach in part of as part of entrepreneurship education. That is, how to recognize an opportunity, how to calculate whether there might be a profit in there for me, and then how to do it, set up the business plan, start the business, and then supervise the production and finding customers. And this is not much of a theory that explains a whole lot of what is going on or what are the implications or anything like that, but it's still notable that Menger mentions it and thinks it's important enough to, in his first volume, of course, the Principles of Economics was supposed to be, I think, 3 volumes, but he only got around to writing the first one. But already in the first volume, he talks about entrepreneurship. And of course, you can't really find entrepreneurship in any other school of economics at that point in time or later, where they placed the entrepreneur that course. It has been with Austrians since the very start, which I think is significant. And there's been no one, as far as I know, in Austrian economics who has sort of downplayed or claimed that entrepreneurship is not a core function in the economy and a core driver behind change. Instead, entrepreneurship is a main part in practically every thinker's works, explicitly or implicitly, and I'll get back to that. It's not always the case that Austrian scholars have discussed entrepreneurship theory separately. So if you look at, for instance, Mises's Human Action, his magnum opus, there is definitely a lot of entrepreneurship in it, but there's no chapter on entrepreneurship. So it's scattered throughout the pages, and you will have to find sort of a half page there, a few sentences there, and maybe a subsection here. But there's no sort of combined discussion on entrepreneurship per se, or only entrepreneurship. Kerzner was the first one to do that in his 1973 book that I'll get to a little bit later. But we have, of course, there's some controversy about Kerzner's approach, and there's also a lot of work that has been done after that. And I'll talk a little bit about the controversy, the different aspects and the different perspectives on entrepreneurship, different understandings of it. And then I'll end with my own take, which might be the least interesting part of this talk, but bear with me. And then I'll open for questions and answers. I hope to leave a little time for that. So first of all, then, in Austrian economics, we have a focus already in Menger's treatise on goods and what goods are for. And the goods are scarce from the perspective of people's wants, and goods are there as means to satisfy the wants that we have, or reduce the felt uneasiness in Mises's language. In this economy, we also recognize that production takes time. So you start out and you want to create a product that hopefully within a market setting, you will find customers willing to pay for. The production is intended to lessen the burden of scarcity on people, so reduce their uneasiness, but also increase the usability, if you will, or the effectiveness of nature and of the world around us, so that we can satisfy not only wants to a greater extent, but also wants that are more urgent to us. So of course, with production, what we do is we take and combine factors like land and labor and make certain that are much more specific out of the combination, so that we can use things much more effectively. So of course, baking bread would much more effectively reduce our hunger than just walking out in the field and start to munch on random wheat that is ungrown and wild. So of course, putting together, clearing a part of the forest, sowing wheat, making it into flour, or mixing it with water and yeast and what have you, and putting it in an oven that someone has produced to produce bread that makes it much more enjoyable, but also the calories and everything much more easily accessible, so you can satisfy that want much, much more effectively. And that's the whole point of any type of production that we undertake, right? And this process is enhanced and improved by investing in capital, by which we mean things and machines that improve the productivity and the capability of labor to produce things. So in the example of bread, we already have the oven, for instance. We might have a plow to and I don't know, a tractor or what have you. Those sort of things that make it much more makes labor invested much more useful, in the sense that we need much less of it in order to produce the same output, or we can produce things that we couldn't produce without these tools. And that's also part of the production process, of course. Now, within this whole production apparatus, entrepreneurship is the force that sort of bears the uncertainty of it, that undertakes the creation of new goods and services and presents them to customers, that is, consumers. There's a problem here that mainstreamers tend to underestimate and misunderstand, namely uncertainty. That when you start production, you can't know that it actually will satisfy wants. So this is something that I refer to as value uncertainty. There might be other uncertainties too, such as you're not sure that you will be able to produce the product that you want to produce. But that's really a technological problem, that you are ignorant of whether you have the ability. That's a different thing, because what you're trying to do with production is to hit consumers and satisfy consumers where they are in the future. And you don't only not know that, but you can't know that, because they will respond to the different options that they have at that point in time. And you produce perhaps one option, but there are other options available. And you also don't know exactly who they are. So there are too many unknown variables to be able to predict this. And entrepreneurship is sort of the function in the economy that produces, in a sense, the future situation in which consumers can choose from different types of goods and services in order to satisfy their wants. So entrepreneurship is sort of the driving force behind production of novel things and new things, and changing things up and inventing, in a sense, the more productive use of the world, the physical world, and also of labor, so that we can satisfy more people, and to a greater extent, and more urgent wants as well. Okay, so entrepreneurship then is focused on the value that is created. It's not really about the stuff that is produced. And if you read Menger, then it's pretty clear that he's talking about the value defines what is a good and so forth. And good entrepreneurs and sound entrepreneurs, they focus on the value as well. So they start with, or should start with, identifying and recognizing what they can contribute to consumers. What is something that they can produce, whether it's a situation, whether it's a product, whatever it is, in which they can be of as great service as possible to consumers. Because the value determines the price that consumers are willing to pay for it. Entrepreneurs can, of course, ask for whatever price they like, but in the end, it is the consumer who decides whether it's worth it or not. So you can, if you want to, produce, let's go back to the bread example, a loaf of bread, and you can sell it for $1 million. You can ask for $1 million for it, which would be easy to cover your costs and earn a ton of profit. But no one is going to accept that. So you don't have the power as an entrepreneur to set the price. You have the responsibility to discover the price where the consumer will accept it, and where you can keep the cost low enough to earn a profit yourself. So in a sense, the way I use in a couple of my own works is a value is greater than price is greater than cost. And in this, we can see that there are two types of profit, right? So you sell a good that you have produced if you can offer the consumer profit, that is the value that they get out of it or expect out of it is higher than the cost to them, that is the price they're paying, which is typically the other types of satisfaction they can get for goods that cost the same amount of money. So that's a sort of subjective ranking that they are willing to give up the money they're paying to get the product or service that you're offering so that they get a profit. The greater the profit, the lower the price compared to the value you're offering, the easier it is to sell whatever it is you're selling. None of those are really decided by you. You as an entrepreneur, you try to produce as much value as possible, and then you try to discover the price that you can ask for it, where consumers are happy to pay it, yet where you can still choose the cost of production that is so that you can get a little bit in between the cost and the price. So the proper approach to entrepreneurship is to discover or estimate, in a sense, the value of what you're trying to produce for consumers, which of course means the better you know the consumer to satisfy them, the better you understand the economy and the future, the easier it is to buy the consumer in this future point in time where you hope to offer this product. So you maximize the value for them. You try to be as great service as possible. Then based on that, you get an indication of what price you might be able to charge and that they will accept. And then your only choice variable really is the cost of production. And this gives us a lot of insight into what is it that drives prices and what drives costs in the economy and so forth. The price that you think that you can charge as an entrepreneur justifies taking on the cost and not the other way around. Okay, so when, for instance, Apple's iPhone, when they produce in this ton of money, and then they use all these expensive materials and they put a lot of money and effort into producing a good design and so forth. And how can they afford that? They can afford that because they expect to sell a certain number of iPhones at a certain price. So that is the limit of how much they can invest in the production. So the reason it costs a lot to produce an iPhone is that the selling price is high, not the other way around. Okay, so it's not the case that costs drive price, it's the other way around, that the value that you expect to produce determines the price, which in turn determines the cost that you can afford. Of course, you can make mistakes as an entrepreneur, but that's a different matter. The only variable that you can really decide yourself is the cost of production. And of course, you choose costs in order to make a profit if you can, but also to make sure that you get the value necessary to justify the price for the consumer so that you can then earn a profit. Okay. So the problem here is that you might say that, well, why don't you just ask customers what they want, and then it would be so much easier. The problem is that they're reacting to the situation they're in, and very often we don't know what we want, especially in terms of a very specific product. We might know in general, say that, oh, we want a flying car. Okay, but what type of flying car? Well, that is not clear to us, and many different attempts at flying cars might not actually be very exciting to us. So it has to fit us in whatever situation we're in, and that is sort of the problem that entrepreneurs wrestle with, that you can't really, as Steve Jobs put it, design a product using focus groups, because consumers don't understand the technology, they don't understand the engineering, they don't understand how to make it, and they also don't really understand what they're looking for. So someone will have to take this step and have sort of a vision and imagine what can be done, and then make it happen, and then hope and pray basically that it is close to and produces value for people. And Henry Ford has a quote. It's apparently apocryphal, so it's not actually real, but I love it still. And he said basically that if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, because back then everybody had a horse and carriage for transportation, but very few had cars. And cars were sort of you ordered a tailor-made car from a car manufacturer. There was no assembly line production or anything like that, and cars were really, really expensive. So only the rich would have them. And Ford realized that if it could produce a car that was so cheap, meaning affordable, that people in general could afford buying it, they would prefer that to having a horse and carriage. So he set about doing that, and of course that changed the world. That's the lesson from this, right? That had he asked them what they wanted, they would have said, well, it would be nice if the horse wasn't moody, or the horse could run a little faster or something like that. But other than that, I'm not sure. And then would he have said, well, how about a horse and carriage without the horse? And of course, they would have said, you're an idiot. What are you talking about? Why would I replace a horse with something with like an engine or something like that I can't really trust and I don't understand and what have you? But he thought, I think that they would actually prefer it if I show it to them and I can have them test drive it or whatever, and I can offer it at a price that they can afford, then this is going to change their lives. They're going to choose that over horse and carriage any day of the week. In this case, he was right. So of course, he made a fortune and created an empire, business empire, and so forth, right? So, but the thing is that what he realized and what is core to this is that the value is determined by the consumer at the end of the process. And you as an entrepreneur will have to try to figure that out when you get started. The cost comes first, the value comes last, but the value is what determines everything else. Okay, so this means that it's really value creation that drives the market and entrepreneurs' perception of what value they can create for people, in a sense, regardless of regulations. So if they find some enormous value that they think that they can contribute and it's illegal, well, the value is still there and consumers would still value it, at least we think so. Well, that's an incentive to act in the black market. And that's why there are black markets, right? That's why narcotics and things like that people value perhaps too highly, but we can't really say anything about their valuation. So that's why, even though there are and can be draconian measures by the state to try to stop this, it's still so valuable, these types of products, that there are entrepreneurs or mafias in this case trying to satisfy the want, because they can get such a high price out of it that it covers the cost of getting caught a number of times, of having a bunch of your employees, quote unquote, put in jail, and invest a lot in trying to escape the law and customs officers and what have you, right? So the value still justifies the actions. And since this is the case, entrepreneurship turns really into a force that can undermine the state's power and push it to retreat. So what I usually claim is that entrepreneurship really disrupts the government. Of course, the government can both attempts to control and disrupt entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship, at the end of the day, speaks with the power of consumers and can force the government back or really crush the government in a sense too. And then we see this in the example of Uber, where the taxi cab business was highly regulated by politicians or the state and incumbents. So owners of taxi companies were the regulators of the taxi business. Of course, it was really almost impossible to start another taxi company because in order to do that, in order to get a license and so forth, you had to do business exactly like the existing taxi companies. and if you do business exactly like an incumbent, then you can't really undercut them because they have already made all the mistakes. They've already covered the expense and the cost of their investments and so forth, whereas you will have to cover that now as a startup. So it's an excellent way of protecting an industry from competition by simply forcing everyone to do what everybody's already doing. Now, Uber, when they started, they took on the regulatory state and these regulations by simply saying that, well, we're not a taxi company. We just provide a matching service or ride sharing, as it's called, right? Where we have people who are willing to drive for a buck or two, and then we have people willing to ride, and then we just connect the two. We don't run a taxi service. We don't have any cars. We don't have any employees that drive. Nothing like this at all, right? So they sidestepped the regulations completely, and in many places, this, of course, the politicians freaked out, and the monopolists or the taxi companies, they also freaked out for the simple reason that, well, wait a minute, we can't compete with this. And there's an example from many towns in the US and elsewhere in the world where Uber launched the service, and the taxi companies, of course, the first reaction by the powers that be is, of course, to try to stop them in different ways. But it's really difficult to stop something new like this that they don't really understand and that consumers value highly, because consumers will still choose it, as the black markets are sort of an example of. And then very often the incumbents and the regulatory state, they would quickly roll back the regulations they have, often with the taxi companies who had benefited from their monopoly status or their protected status. They would ask very strongly or call for the government to deregulate the business so that they could properly compete with Uber, because they couldn't cut the costs while complying with the regulations. So in many towns here in the US, it was a local law or a local decree that protected taxi businesses, which is now rolled back to a great extent because taxi companies chose to forego and get rid of their privileges because Uber came from out of left field pretty much and undermined their chances of making a profit running their businesses as they used to. So this sort of illustrates the power of entrepreneurship, to offer value to consumers and thereby sort of crash and crush the regulations that protect incumbents by simply re-envisioning or reimagining how to satisfy consumers. As long as you have consumers on your side and consumers really appreciate your service and think there's a great value in it, you can force a change in the marketplace. And I think that is really encouraging, and it's also it makes me optimistic, regardless of what politicians invent and how they act. That entrepreneurs can, in sort of in both big and small scale, force deregulation and force the state back, and really release the value for consumers, which is really the point I'm making. Okay, so this means, of course, that we can't really understand the market without entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is, of course, affected by the state, but it also can undermine the state and push the state back and or force institutional change. Entrepreneurship is what creates these new products. Entrepreneurship is what outcompetes the old. Entrepreneurship is the reason there is no Sears anymore. Of course, no one can compete with Sears. Well, Sears doesn't really exist anymore. So now we say, well, you can't really compete with Amazon or Walmart or what have you. But the thing is that as long as there is entrepreneurship, the competition is to create value for consumers. The competition is not to be big and have a lot of financial muscle, quote unquote, because that doesn't mean anything. If someone else can imagine a way to create new and greater value for consumers, it doesn't matter how big you are. The bigness, as a corporation, when exposed to value creative entrepreneurship only means that the bigger you are, the harder you're going to fall. It means nothing else. You can't really protect yourself other than by innovating yourself and try to pursue consumer value and make life as pleasant as possible for consumers. It also means, of course, that entrepreneurship is the driving force of the market process, that where's the economy headed, what is being produced and how and to what extent and things like that. Those decisions are made by entrepreneurs who stand to gain or go out of business, depending on how well they perceive entrepreneur or consumers' future valuation. Entrepreneurs bear this uncertainty, but they also contribute to it, as I show in my most recent book, that disruptive entrepreneurs, much like Uber, they cause uncertainty for other actors in the economy. So there was not a whole lot of uncertainty for taxi businesses until Uber. So because there was a chance for someone to produce value for consumers in a different way, that means that you're not really safe, even if you are protected. So entrepreneurship, in this sense, exposes incumbents to the uncertainty of the future, in the sense that they might not think about, but that they're definitely subject to. Okay, so let's go into some different perceptions of entrepreneurship within Austrian economics, and I'm going to start with Hayek, and I think you'll see why, and especially his discussion in The Use of Knowledge in Society from 1945, where it's really a discussion on the price mechanism, where he's talking about how prices, in a sense, aggregate information of the particular circumstance of time and place that people have in different places. And since people respond to prices in terms of prices of the costs, the inputs in their productions, and they make choices, as I said in the beginning, of which costs to assume in production. If the price of something goes up, entrepreneurs are going to economize much harder on that thing and use less of it, and use it towards much more value creative productions. And if something becomes cheaper, then they're going to use more of that instead. So they're going to choose the lower cost items for a simple reason, that their profit depends on it, right? So when Hayek talks about the marvel of the market, he's talking about how the economy, as an invisible hand, as Adam Smith put it, really responds to these changes in prices, and they do that automatically. You don't have to push them, you don't have to tell them, you don't have to do anything, because it's in their self-interest to respond to these changes. And he uses the tin example where for some reason the tin shoots up, and that of course means that whatever production processes and entrepreneurs using tin in their production as a cost in their production, they're going to try to use less of it, try to find alternatives, materials, and so forth. And the same thing, if the price would fall, they would use it more liberally. They would use it instead of other materials and so forth. So the economy will, in this sense, create value at the lowest cost possible, because that's in the interest of entrepreneurs. The price system means that entrepreneurs don't need to have perfect information or information about the specifics in any situation. And of course, it's also impossible, as Hayek argued. You can't really aggregate tacit information or tacit knowledge. That's not really formalizable, and you can't really express it well. So you can't communicate it. But you also don't need to, because prices aggregate what is necessary to know, meaning simply that it is the cost of your inputs. So you're going to stay away from the costly ones, unless your selling price justifies choosing it. So say you're producing something that you think tin is necessary for, and you think that the value you're creating in this good is going to be really, really high, and therefore warrant a high selling price. Well, that justifies using very costly tin, whereas for another entrepreneur producing something also using tin, for maybe that is the best way to produce it engineering wise, but they produce less value, so they can't really warrant a high price, which means they can't afford the tin. So they have to use a material that is perhaps engineering wise, so technologically speaking, inferior, but economically speaking, it's they use that other material because it's more plentiful and um, they don't produce enough value to justify using this dearer input. Okay, so the second person, or the second theorist to discuss is Israel Kirzner. He was a student of Mises, and he also says that his theory is based on and elaborates on Mises' theory of entrepreneurship. In my own work, I sort of disagree with that claim, and I think that his theory of entrepreneurship is much closer to Hayek's, really. And you'll see a little bit later what I mean by that. His famous work here is Competition and Entrepreneurship from 1973, the orange one in the lower right corner. Kirzner theorized on entrepreneurship as alertness to opportunities. And opportunities are basically price discrepancies. So there's the link to Hayek, right? That if prices are different, then you can act on those prices. You don't need to know anything else really about the economy, but that prices differ. It's a little bit different from Hayek, though, because Kirzner talks about how when an entrepreneur, a pure entrepreneur, sees or is alert to the fact that prices differ in different markets or in different contexts, and they differ so much that you can, through simple arbitrage, make the difference. So you buy low and sell high of the same thing, and therefore you equilibrate the economy because you're sort of forcing the law of one price onto the market as a whole by balancing and adjusting the price in these two submarkets. To Kirzner, the entrepreneur doesn't really have to own anything, or the pure entrepreneur doesn't have to own anything. It doesn't have any capital, but the capital is, of course, owned by the capitalist function. So the pure entrepreneur is sort of dependent on the capitalist function, but it's sufficient to just see the opportunity, and therefore there is profit in it because it's objective, right? Because if the price is low over there and it's high over here, then it's an objective fact that you can buy at the low price and sell at the high price, and thereby change prices in both places. So it's the opportunity is objective. This is just a matter of, are you alert enough to see it, and are you alert enough to see it soon? So a famous quote from his book is what is on the screen here, that entrepreneurship, to Kirzner, does not consist of grasping a free $10 bill, which one has already discovered to be resting in one's hand. It's not about the grasping. It consists in realizing that it is in one's hand and that it is available for grasping. So the acting on it is not really entrepreneurship to Kirzner. It's just the perception or the identification, the discovery of the opportunity to earn a profit. That's pure entrepreneurship. The action after that requires capital and requires all these other things, so it involves other functions as well. This means that to Kirzner, entrepreneurship is an equilibrating force, because what entrepreneurs are really doing when they're discovering these price discrepancies is that they correct errors in the marketplace. So by then acting on these errors through starting a business or involving a capitalist or whatever, then you solve the problem of the same thing having two different prices. And those different prices, of course, are the result of previous errors committed in the economy. It doesn't necessarily mean that people have made just pure mistakes. It could mean simply that people have not made perfect decisions. So because there is some imperfection in their decisions, there's price discrepancies that arise as a result. Okay, so the entrepreneur then, the pure entrepreneur, is just alert to these opportunities. I should stress probably that to Kirzner, alertness is not a quality that only entrepreneurs have, but it's a quality that we all have. It's just that entrepreneurs tend to be more alert than the rest of us. And that sort of signifies the entrepreneurship function, that they are the most alert of us, and therefore they are first to discover these price discrepancies and therefore can earn a profit from them. Whereas the rest of us, we might also see it eventually, but then it's too late, so we can't really profit from it. Okay, the next Austrian, or half Austrian perhaps, I want to talk about is Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter was a student of Bauwerk's, and he went to Bauwerk's seminar together with Mises, actually. So they were there at the same time, students at the same time. Schumpeter later sort of turned his back on Austrian economics and became a pseudo-mainstreamer, I suppose. He left Austria, or the empire, for the US and Harvard, and he became enamored with Walrasian economics. So the use of math in economic analysis and economic theorizing to figure out how things are actually the state of things in the economy. So he liked that part. He didn't actually use a lot of math, which is a little strange when I say that he was enamored by that method, but he saw a lot of potential in it. But his books are definitely readable and don't really include any math at all. And the ones on the screen are his two most famous ones. My favorite is The Theory of Economic Development, which is one of his early books, in which he makes the entrepreneur the force behind economic development and economic growth. So to Schumpeter, already somewhat, even though he wrote it and published it in 1911, so he was in Austria at that point, he was still influenced by Walras and the mathematical method. So he described the economy as a circular flow. I think there's more of a Say's law style thinking behind that than the circular flow when you take an economics class today. So it's not nearly as formalized and mathematical in a sense as the circular flow is today in textbooks, but he used the same terms. And in this circular flow, he hypothesized or theorized that all resources are used in production of value. But things are sort of much like Mises' evenly rotating economies. Things are not really changing. So it's the sort of the state of affairs in any mature industry, if you will. But then the entrepreneur has an idea for how to combine resources in different ways and produce new value. So he goes about doing that. He buys resources from producers who are already using them and puts them together in a new way and creates a new good or a new service or opens a new market or what have you, that creates more value for consumers and therefore more profit for the entrepreneur. And then as a result, all the other producers see what he's doing and they follow suit and they copy what it's doing, and thus the economy is established at a higher level with a new circular flow, but at a higher level of valued output. That's sort of his theory behind economic growth and economic development. And in here, of course, the entrepreneur is a disruptor. So the entrepreneur is disequilibrating. So in a sense, the opposite of Kerzner, who was talking about the entrepreneur as a solver of or corrector of errors in the economy. Here, the entrepreneur sort of smashes the status quo and creates at least a potential for a new status quo. He calls this creative destruction, which means that you create something new that in turn, because it is of greater value to consumers, destroys the old. So much like Henry Ford producing the Model T, and therefore and people recognize the value in having a car, that in turn destroyed, quote unquote, the horse and carriage. And a lot of manufacturers of carriages and breeders of horses and things like that, because consumers simply didn't want that value anymore. So it's not really about destruction, it's the implications of creating new and greater value. And he called this putting factors together in new combinations. That's sort of his term for innovation. So he's been called the prophet of innovation, and talked a lot about that. And he has had a way with words. So many of these terms that you might have heard, like creative destruction and things like that, are Schumpeterian. The next person I want to talk about is Ludwig Lachmann. He was a radical subjectivist. He had a kaleidic view of the economy, meaning that you can't really tell at all. The future is unknowable. You can imagine, you can form expectations about it, but exactly what the future brings, we can't really know. So what matters when you're producing is to make sure that your production plan, which is basically the starting of and running of a business to create products, is coordinated with other entrepreneurs' plans. Because by doing so, you make sure that there's no contradiction between you and what everybody else is doing. And therefore, you can finalize and you can actually bring about the products that you set out to bring about. So he places the entrepreneur, therefore, within the capital structure as the force that changes production overall by simply combining productive capital in new ways. And this is a quote from his Capital and its Structure. It says that we're living in a world of unexpected change, hence capital combinations, which is basically the combinations of Schumpeter. And with them, the capital structure overall, the whole production apparatus, will be ever-changing, will be dissolved and reformed in this activity. So the force behind changing, dissolving, and reforming the capital structure, that's the real function of the entrepreneur, per Lachmann. Okay, so moving ahead to Mises, he defined entrepreneurship praxeologically as simply uncertainty bearing. So there's an entrepreneurial aspect of any action, and it is the fact that we can't know exactly the value of the value outcome of what we're doing, and that uncertainty is entrepreneurial, and that's entrepreneurship function. Of course, that includes such mundane, simple, everyday things as, am I going to the bathroom? Am I going to be successful? Am I going to get the relief that I expect? And things like that, which you might think that's not very entrepreneurial. I've been to the bathroom before. It's not going to have a whole lot of effect on the economy. And you would be absolutely right. There's not a whole lot of entrepreneurship the way we tend to think about it in that type of action. But he defined it that way praxeologically, as just simply uncertainty bearing, following a long tradition in economics doing that. But he also claimed that entrepreneurship is the driving force of the market process, as we talked about before. And he argued that, well, there is this thing that he referred to as the entrepreneur promoter, who is the force behind creating new types of value, that creates new production processes and facilitates new goods and services that, in a sense, change the direction of the economy. So much like Henry Ford's Model T again, right? It completely changed how the economy works and what expectations people have about the economy and how they lead their lives and things like that. And that's not merely uncertainty bearing. It's an actual force in the economy, and we know this empirically, that these people and this force exists, and it has an enormous impact on the economy. Mises didn't find a way to define this praxeologically because he couldn't derive it directly from action. So he said that, well, it's a concept that economics cannot do without, but I can't define it, and that sucks, sort of. So he moved on and stuck with sort of the broader definition as uncertainty bearing in general, while still pointing out that the promoter is super important for understanding the economy, but praxeologically we can't really say a whole lot about it. And I always found this problematic, to say the least, because if it is the driving force of the economy and it is this central function in the market process, then it's really problematic if we can't even define it. if we can't figure out what this is praxeologically, then we're in deep trouble. So I actually found a way to define it, and I wrote an article in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics where I define it praxeologically to try to sort of form a theoretical basis for studying entrepreneurship as an Austrian, and also fleshing out what it is that entrepreneur promoters do that is different from other actors in the economy. So this is what I've tried to do to simplify it a little bit in several of my books. So my latest one is the light blue one there, the Entrepreneurship and Evolutionary Economics, which is sort of it's positioned as a critique of evolutionary economics. So evolutionary economics is a semi-mainstream attempt to draw from Schumpeter, but they completely misunderstand value, and they think that what matters is technological inventions. Whereas as an Austrian, we understand that it's not really the technology itself, it's how you use it and how you present it and what you make it do that matters, and especially whether that creates a value for consumers. So in this little book, which is not very long, I sort of use Austrian ideas to undermine evolutionary economics and prove that they got everything backwards, pretty much. So if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to send you a PDF of it. But what I do is I draw from Mises and Menger, and I use the value price cost thing that we talked about before. I combine that with economic calculation, which of course the entrepreneur is central to economic calculation as a process in the economy. So we needed to explain these sort of things. And I discuss the promoter, and I place the promoter where I think the promoter should be, that is center stage, in forming and shaping and determining the future state of the market and creating new products for consumers to decide whether to use and how valuable they're going to be, and so forth. And also, of course, how they affect prices. So my next book project is a book on Austrian price theory, which is going to be published sometime next year. It's also going to be one of those small elements, they're called, which is just a really short book, but still, hopefully I can pull all the threads together and tie up all the loose ends and show how Austrian price theory differs from mainstream price theory, and thereby, in a sense, combine and provide a link between Mises' promoter and Hayek's price mechanism, that sort of thing. And you have a list of some of my core entrepreneurship works. And I think I have all of these as a PDF. So if you're interested, just email me and I'll send you whichever you're interested in. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions or your concerns and critiques.
Okay. Thank you, Per, for your lecture. Should we give him a round of applause now? Yeah, okay. I have two questions. I have two questions. The first one, kind of unrelated, but has been on my mind that I couldn't find on Google, is do you know how many doctoral PhD students Mises had under him?
I do not know. And I'm actually also not sure in what sense they might have been Mises' PhD students, right? Because I know that, I mean, since he was at NYU, he probably had PhD students before that too. But at NYU, he wasn't really paid by the university. But I think that students got credits for studying under him. So I mean, I know that Rothbard and Kerzner did, for instance, but to what extent you can count them as his formal students? I mean, from the perspective of me being a professor and thinking in terms of academic credits, they're obviously his students in other ways.
Yeah, I read somewhere it was 6, but I'm really not sure. My next question is, how can Austrians be better promoters in the ideas that we have?
Wow, what a question. Well, to me, what is I think it's sort of top of mind for me, but I think educating and interacting with entrepreneurs is and businessmen in general, sort of practitioners as academics call them, which is not necessarily a very nice term. Um, but for the simple reason that when I interact with entrepreneurs and also experienced businessmen, they are already Austrian. They just don't know it. So they think like Austrians, but they lack the terminology and they lack the words, they lack the theories. So they haven't really necessarily connected the dots. So they don't have the framework, but they understand prices. They understand that the customer is king. They understand that they have to satisfy the customer to the greatest extent they can in order to place the sale. They understand the logic behind competition, like I talked about, and things like that. So they get this, but they can become even more effective and powerful by learning a little bit basic Austrian economics, pretty much, right? Just much like just reading my primers you have on the screen, right? Just providing them with that and having them read it if they find time to read or talk to them. And then setting examples, showing that, well, it's actually much easier to be a successful entrepreneur if you think about it the right way. And the right way is to think about it like an Austrian, like I presented before, right? You place the consumer first, and then you try to figure out how you can be of service to them. And then, of course, the rest of the economic theory as well. But I think that is probably the most effective way of getting the message out to inform and educate business practice, because it's also going to increase the chances for and the rate of economic growth too. So we're going to get more prosperity out of it.
Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for
All right, happy to do it. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening.